Dusk is a proper return to the aesthetic and mechanics of an earlier time in PC gaming. Being a product of a different era means it can be broken down into a very simplistic pair of statements. Don't die. Everything is out to kill you. Make sure you kill it first. When taken at face value, it seems shallow, but the depth comes from the things that make this game special. Horror aesthetic, implied storyline, movement, weapon feedback. These are the things that Doom and Doom 2 did extremely well, which is why they're the gold standard. Strip away the dopamine-inducing leveling systems, loot boxes, and the 2-weapon limit. These systems do serve a purpose in another context, but don't add much to a game like Dusk. Dusk did something that many games don't or can't do. It taught me how to win as I was playing it, and the key component turned out to be character movement. Movement of the player character is fast and responsive. Virtually all projectiles can be dodged, which adds a layer of survivability in desperate situations. The game plays around with vertical space in a way that I feel more games should be trying to do. As a consequence, there's no fall damage, which takes some getting used to, as I was expecting similar fall damage mechanics to Quake. Competitive FPS games of an earlier generation had players constantly jumping around the map in what was known as bunny hopping. Though I often tried to emulate it back in the day, I was never the master of this technique. By the time I was coordinated enough to really put in the effort, game engines had progressed to the point that bunny hopping was no longer possible. Dusk, in the spirit of its design, brings this ability back to the table. In fact, there comes a point in Dusk where the normal 2D movement just isn't enough to beat some of the tougher enemies and bosses. The game forces the player to adapt by using all the tools they have in their arsenal, not just the game's weapons. The game literally taught me to bunny hop, and that without it, the game wasn't going to get beat. One of the game's last bosses is a bunny hopping player-sized dealer of death. It feels like you're playing in a multiplayer match with another human, who has all of your strengths, and they've got 5 times the amount of health.
At last.
The guns in the game represent the basic tool set of a classic first-person shooter. Shotgun, grenade launcher, machine gun, etc. All of these tools feel exactly as they should, and that they have the appropriate stopping power, noise generation, and feeling when fired. Weapons sway with character movement and cause blowback. Despite how often you use certain weapons, they remain satisfying until the end of the game. Dusk stays true to its design by selling the aesthetic and incorporates unique characteristics, even if they are functionally cosmetic. A good example of this is the rocket launcher being a red-hot rivet launcher, which makes it feel more badass. What surprised me was how powerful the crossbow felt. Normally reserved for the silent takedown option, this crossbow shoots projectiles that penetrate walls and other enemies. This means you can take down entire groups of enemies with a weapon that is normally considered a precision tool in video game contexts. What's even more interesting is that the crossbow causes a significant amount of blowback to your player while firing. Many of the levels in the game end in a cliff to the abyss below. I found myself having to switch away from the crossbow when death by falling was a threat. The extra layer of planning is present when fighting certain enemy types as well. You eventually start to know how much punishment some enemies can take, and right when you think you have their patterns down, they throw another enemy type into the mix. And now you have to adjust your movement strategy, weapon selection, and targeting priority to match. The game feels like someone blended Quake, Doom, Blood, Redneck Rampage, and a sprinkle of the SCP Wiki for good measure. The level environments start off in a grounded farmhouse and promptly descend into the surreal. game that emphasizes movement feels right at home in wide open spaces. Some of the best combat in this game can be found in those wide open levels. But the game sets itself apart when the corridors close in. The horror elements really get a chance to shine during these levels. It provides a change of pace that keeps the tension high without sacrificing the strong points of the shooting mechanics. It feels like the levels are set up to give the player a crafted experience with carefully placed secrets and Easter eggs. Something I feel that a roguelike experience cannot emulate. All of the design decisions are punctuated and enhanced by the supremely excellent soundtrack by Andrew Hulshult. It's a mix of metal and industrial sounds that adapt to the current gameplay situation, much like Doom 2016. And like that game, it's a soundtrack that you can listen to outside of the game context. When enemies are bearing down on you, that music comes up and fuels your bloodlust. The game slows down and the player is creeping through a hellish installation, the music is what builds up the tension. All of these elements together is what makes Dusk a fun game to play. I felt like the hardest available difficulty at the start was how the game is meant to be played. If you screw up, it's your fault. I did dip into the easier difficulty settings, only to find that none of the enemies really posed a threat. That being said, it's worth playing for the aesthetic and mechanics alone, regardless of skill level. Anyone who's looking for a visceral FPS experience that does retro shooter correctly, Dusk is the game for you.